Alright, so I think it's about time that I made a motion blur tutorial. If there's one thing that I get asked every time I upload a video, it's, hey Dylan, what makes your clip so smooth? What kind of motion blur do you use? You know, questions like that, you know, they don't get repetitive or annoying, so. But, you know, I figured I'd make this video anyways. So, here I just have a normal clip I took from the intro of, I don't know, episode 120. So, normally, one thing about motion blur, it works with just, you know, your default color profile and your default settings. But for me, the most common thing throughout all my videos is I use a preset for Magic Bullet Looks, which it does sharpen up the lines a bit. So as you can see, it also introduces a little bit of noise here. There's a lot of pixelation in here, but I'll show you how to fix that in a sec. For the sake of consistency, I'm gonna keep my typical color filter. I usually just drag it right there. If you want to see it before and after, it's something like there. And this isn't a necessary step, but it helps the motion blur later on. The way the motion blur works is by interpolating between frames and blurring them, kind of drawing its own frames in between, kind of like Twixtor, if you know how that works. And if you sharpen up the lines a bit and give a little bit more contrast, and you know this is also common in someone like DBZ33Q's videos, you typically get better motion tracking and as a result better blur. Typically I also add from BCC for getting rid of all this nasty noise that gets introduced by the sharpening. That really becomes obvious when you export as a high quality 1080p video with a high bitrate. That really starts to show up. To get rid of that noise, I like to use BCC noise reduction. I have my preset here, but I'm going to go ahead with the default just to show what some of the settings do. Spatial smoothing, as you can see, it can have a big difference. This beginning clip is a really good example because you can see all that nasty noise there. And none of it's going to go away completely. You're still going to have artifacts there, but can't hurt to smooth it out a little bit. I think with 2D animation like Dragon Ball Z, it's much better to just have maxed out spatial smoothing range and then just mess with the color space. It just helps give new quality to old clips. I appreciate that. So that's going to be the clip that we use. You can see here there's still some noise there, and unfortunately that's just not going to go away. It could if I cranked up the settings, but I prefer the way this looks. The close-ups are nice, not really any noticeable movement here. The most important thing, well, in my opinion, about rendering your AMV, if you're going to be using motion blur like I do, is to use these render settings. Now, I think I just based this off of the Sony YUV and completely changed all the settings, so any basic AVI profile will work. But for frame size, I say use project settings because I don't know, I might make a project in 4:3 aspect ratio one day, a RAW or something like that. So I just say use project settings. Since it's 1080p, that's going to be fine. That is set in your actual project settings, so not much you can do about that here. The most important thing about this, you have to render uncompressed. You can use some of these, like I believe that the Xvid codec, which is it doesn't come with Vegas, you have to separately install it. I believe that works with AviSynth, which is what does the motion blur. But uncompressed gives you usually the best quality, but just be warned that if you have a large clip, the file size might get big. So that's that. For audio, I just crank it up to 192 hertz, 1000 hertz, 24-bit depth, stereo, because I don't need all these channels of audio when I'm using it. Plus, go uncompressed. I'm not an audiophile. I don't really know that much about the differences between these, but I always use PCM uncompressed because avoiding compression usually gives you better quality. So, I'll take quality wherever I can get it. Project, I always go to video rendering quality and say best, no matter what, because sometimes it'll default to good, or usually, yeah, it'll default to good. So I like to go best, even if I have it set in my project settings, just for the hell of it. Stereoscopic 3D mode doesn't fucking matter unless you're using fucking 3D glasses like an idiot. Or maybe that might be interesting. Maybe I'll do that. Color space, again, I don't know a whole lot about this. I know sRGB is typically good, but I have all of my filters set up because of the way it ends up looking, so messing with this, I'm afraid, will change something. So I typically just leave it alone. Running this shouldn't take too much time. It's just a fucking 3-second clip. So open folder, it's there, you can play it back. You can see the frames, for some reason, like I have a 2 gigabit per second read, or 3 gigabit per second read speed on my SSD, so that's definitely not the issue here. I don't know why the file size is just crippling. The frame rate is not that choppy, and if it is, then fuck, motion blur does a lot for my videos and I just don't realize it. From here on out, it's gonna get a little bit complicated, but don't get discouraged. I'll try my best to explain it, but if I don't, feel free to leave a comment below asking for clarification or something. So on my desktop, I have my motion blur script right here. I'll be leaving this in the description, or maybe a slightly modified version of this so that, I can keep my sort of secretive motion blur. I have given it out to a few people, so if I give out a different version and someone wants to put my actual one down below, I'm not going to stop you. A lot of this, if you're into scripting at all, I'll leave a link to the MV Tools 2 article that explains all these different variables and how to adjust them. It's a pain in the ass to adjust because you kind of have to, you can't have it open in another program and be adjusting it at the same time like I'm used to with every other effect that I use. So to tune these scripts, you have to make a change, render, watch it, decide whether you like it, make a change, rinse and repeat over and over and over until you get it how you like. I found that instead of applying, okay, so the main variable that you're going to want to mess with if you mess with anything is this one, blur, on both. I have it set to 75 and I have the entire effect actually apply twice, because the second smoothing doesn't actually, it smooths out the edges of the motion blur, so you're kind of getting a double smoothing effect. Without these sort of specific variables for the motion vectors, it can introduce artifacts to have more than one instance running one after the other, but I have these set a very specific way. Running one of them looks just fine, and I think a lot of the time that's more than enough. And from video to video, I change the blur amount, because in some videos it's, depending on the song type or the pacing of it, more or less blur is best. So everything down to here is necessary. You can remove this if maybe the performance isn't as good, or the frames are too large, or the file size is getting out of control. You can remove the second instance of motion blur here, but I think it looks better. But it's personal preference, so you'll have to make your own mind up about that. Now, like I said, leaving for, the ambitious people in the audience who want to get into editing this, like I said, will be leaving a link to the official AviSynth MV Tools 2 article, and all the downloads for AviSynth, the AviSynth plugin, and Virtualdub will be in the description below. For the script, since I named it example.avi, here I have it automatically defaulting to my documents folder because that's where I render all of my raw AVI files. So just keep in mind this needs to change to fit your computer. Just find out, like you can look here, you click on, say, example properties, and you have this. You know where the file is, and then you just hit /example.avi and you're good for direct show source in the script. So here you have to edit it every single time you have a new video. There's no way to get around it. Well, no easy way. Like I said, just gonna make that example.avi. I erased AVI, goddamn. Save it. And this is, I'm going to kind of do this in reverse. I'm going to show you what you need to have for, in order to use Virtualdub to produce the proper effects. So you can see here, in my recently opened section, that script is right here. This is just some clip I was using to show how the Danish editor fucked up his clip set with warp sharp, but I'm gonna actually close out of that now. I'm gonna show you a couple of things. Okay, so here we go. I'm actually just gonna go ahead and leave this exact file in the description below. Feel free to download the most recent file from the website. I doubt it's been updated, but it may have been. You never know. Maybe they're more committed than I think, but doubt it. What you need to have installed first in order to install this is actually a plugin for AviSynth. So here, I don't know if I actually have AviSynth in this folder. Oh, I do, here. I'll leave this as well. So what you have to do is, well, this is the installer for AviSynth. You just got to install this, and once you have it installed, you need to go to this PC, local disk, program files by 86, then AviSynth, and go to plugins. As you can see, MV Tools 2 is right here, the DLL file. You just got to copy that, and if you want, you can copy these. I don't use them, but you might have a use for them. So if you want, you can just go right like that and drag them like that. If you don't have 7-zip or WinRAR or something, you need it for the 7-zip files. If you don't feel like installing 7-zip, then you can, I don't know, see if they have normal zip files on the MV Tools website, but I'm going to include this exact file in the description, so there are going to be a couple things you are going to have to download. I mean, that's just how it is with editing. I'm sure you guys know that by all the perfectly legitimate copies of Sony Vegas Pro that we have. This will originally just show up as a text file, these scripts, with the .avs file extension. But once you have AviSynth properly installed, the icon will look like this, or should look like this. Then you edit it like I showed, open Virtualdub, and you should be fine. Just open it like that. You can see that motion blur right there. It interpolates, I don't know, it bases it, okay. The settings I have make it so that each frame interpolates based on 4 frames in either direction. So that's one of the reasons it's so smooth. It looks at 4 frames ahead and behind and kind of merges them into in-between frames. It's still the same frame rate. It's just replacing what would be normal frames. And I'll show a fully rendered version in a bit. Like here you can see this is really good, is going to be real smooth. Now this right here is your input. So that's just the raw AviSynth file. I go like this. This is your output. You, on my screen, I set it to 75% if you have a 1080p panel. If you have 1366, you're going to be at 50. And at 1440p, you're going to have, you can probably have it at 150 unless you're editing in 1440p, which I personally don't recommend. But, like I said, you can see the blur here. Right now, they look the same. They're literally the same. There's nothing Virtualdub is doing to them. It's just the input is the same as the output. But what I do, it helps smooth out the blur more so that these sharp edges kind of blend with the blur a little more. It's not the same as the remove noise, it's similar. I add smoother. I'm not gonna lie, you can see, I'll see if you can tell, just see if you can tell the difference. If you can't, don't sweat it. Every time you add a filter, it increases render time by a lot, so just rendering this raw output video is fine. Like that's probably the best option because it gives you the best speed, but I personally add a couple of filters, and unfortunately they're single threaded, so I believe it can only use like one core, maybe two, to render out your video. So on a quad core CPU, you're only using half of the power, and on my 8 core 2700X, I'm only using a very small percentage of the power. The rest of it is just used for computing between the input and the out, not the filters, but turning the script into actual AVI, an actual AVI file. So this is, I always do this. I don't know, it probably fucks with something, but you know, I've been doing it. I like how my videos look. If you don't, that's obviously fine, but I actually usually add it first. I add warp sharp. This value is a little bit harder to gauge, so I do show a preview. You can see what it does. It really sharpens up lines here. So you do want that smoothing because that right here you can tell is a lot smoother than the blur is here. Or at least I can, and in motion I can tell it has a big difference, or makes a big difference. You don't want to mess with blur passes too much, or you get fucked up clips that look like the Danish editor's pack, or that has all the fucking skinny lines. I'm pretty sure he used Virtualdub with Warp Sharp to batch render his clip pack. But I leave blur passes at 1. Sometimes I do 400, sometimes not. Usually it's somewhere in between like a 275 or usually on the high end because I like how it looks. I know it's not everyone's taste, but I do like the way it looks. So because I usually add this first, I'm going to go ahead and switch it around. And you'll see, if you watch this, this hasn't changed yet to show these filters, and the effects should be pretty obvious switching now. Well, you know, obvious is actually not a good word. Whatever. But you can see there's all this nice motion blur on the back too, so even if you don't have motion blur on the foreground, you got some nice background action going on. Some frames end up not having any motion blur on them. It looks fine to me, so I never, oh yeah, like look at that. The way it interpolates, I just love. I like it a lot more than RSMB. You do get stuff like this, but to be honest, it looks good when it's in motion. It adds sharpness to it. I guess you could consider that an artifact, but I don't. I think it actually helps with the sharpness. You see here, you know, little errors like this, probably just because of slight differences in the color of the line on his chin. But in motion, having little differences like that gives it a more dynamic feel, in my opinion. So you can see those two frames were probably originally the same, except for the background. Like the foreground, all this right here was the same, the background just moved. But now, since we've added the motion blur, you know, we got this proper sort of smooth looking, and it really helps for flying scenes like this. It's gonna get a lot of nice blur on that in the clouds. So again, may not be everyone's taste, but I like it. Now this render is going to be probably ridiculously long, but to render after you've done everything I showed, if you want to add the filters, you don't have to. No matter what, you're going to come here, hit save as AVI, name it whatever the fuck you want. And then just hit save and it'll start rendering. Now, for the render, to make it go faster, turn off background IO, like you just saw that spike. And I typically take off show input video so that it doesn't show this. So I can see it in the background, and turning show output video off gives you an even faster render. So, I mean, just personally, it's not that long for me anyways. So I like to have it on, and you can see the blurring now, really nice. So that's how I do motion blur. I'm going to take it into Sony. I'm going to show you how I actually end up posting the video, because you can see it ends up going from 3 megabytes. Remember that the original file that we rendered, the AVI, the uncompressed one, was 3 megabytes. This one is 600. Like that's more than a 200 times increase in file size. There's a lot of data being thrown around and processed here. So just keep that in mind. It may be more efficient to use something like Real Smart Motion Blur, the plugin for Sony Vegas, but I prefer the way this looks personally. But some people do prefer RSMB, and I respect that. So it's done rendering when it just does this. You can see I can move around again, I don't need to. But then I just go into Vegas, I either create a new project file or I just use the same one that I have called mflow blur. I think my most recent 500 sub special should probably still be in there. Yeah, you know, some of the edits that I made to it. But just have basic access to it. And like here, you can see on Project Media, I have a bunch of my old AMVs, but playing this is going to be, it's still better than rendering just the raw uncompressed AVI, but I think that's mostly due to the motion blur smoothing it out. But if you have a hard drive, these files are going to be hell. Like, I really recommend that you either upgrade to something usable, like any SSD. Hard drives fucking suck. Use a solid state drive. Install it. If you have a shitty laptop, install it. It will increase your render speeds. It'll increase file reading. You can actually watch your AMVs before you post them. Like, I used to use a shitty old laptop with a hard drive. Depending on how fast your CPU is, Virtualdub makes certain compromises based on your system to give you a certain type of motion blur. So you may notice more artifacting if you have a slower system. But if you have anything relatively recent, that probably won't be the case. Higher single core speed versus high multi-core speed typically show completely different results. Like me and Jojishi AMV were talking about that, where I gave him my motion blur script and he tried it out and it looked completely different than mine. I think he had a Intel CPU maybe or something. But it still looks good, and it's I'm sort of glad about that, because it gives me one more way to try and remain unique, quote unquote unique. Fuck, with people like fucking like Conta trying to fucking show me up all the time. It's hard to stay unique, so anything helps. After this, because these files are so massive, if your internet isn't ridiculously fast, it's going to take forever to upload to YouTube, and then it's going to take forever to process if you just upload this raw AVI, especially when you have a full AMV. Like my full motion blur files, I think I still have it from my last AMV. Yeah, here, this should be it. It ended up being 10 fucking gigabytes. For an example, the input I used, I believe, well shit, which one was it? I believe I used Not Envy Planet. So I input a 143 megabyte file. And I get out. Oh wait, no, that, fuck, I don't remember. God damn it. I might have already deleted it. The point is, the files get fucking massive. And so it really helps to convert it to an MP4, so I close that up. Here's whatever the fuck you want. You can see in Vegas, because it downscales and it's better at playing it back, it'll give us smoother playback, because I have it running at half the resolution. It'll give a smoother playback than the original clip. Or I can pre-render. So you can see already, I'll pull up in a second the side-by-side comparison of with and without, and you can decide which you prefer. And I feel really sorry for you if you've just watched this entire video and don't like the way it looks, but actually, fuck you, your fault.